You are listening to the U.S. of N.A. by Nation Beer, a series of stories about the people and places from every corner of the country who are helping fuel the N.A. beer movement. If you like this episode, please add us to your library in Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you prefer to listen. For more great N.A. stories, including our many beer reviews, visit nationbeer.com. Are you a non-alcoholic beverage brand looking for help with growth? Then go to nation.beer to learn more about our digital marketing services. Welcome to the U.S. of N.A. podcast. I'm John Eggleton, your host and chief optimist at Nation Beer. Today's episode is the first of three that will focus on a corner of the upper Midwest, setting up a little road trip we'll be taking to Chicago and Lafayette, Indiana next month. Bit more on that later. Before I give a little background on our guest, let me first do a bit of setup on the N.A. beer contributions of the Windy City. To be honest, it'd be great if there were a few more traditional breweries doing an N.A. beer there for a city as large as Chicago, but they'll get there eventually. In the meantime, the good news is there are a few really exciting emerging players up that way. First is Go Brewing, who, if you've listened to past episodes, has been brought up a lot by multiple guests. They operate out of suburban Naperville, and for many people, they've reached a similar status as Athletic, where everything they produce is consistently good, with lots of new styles and flavors coming out all the time. While we haven't been there yet, we know their tap room is unique in the NA world with so many styles on draft, and they even have full alcohol guest taps. To us, that's pretty cool because usually it's the NAs that get relegated to the kiddie portion of the menu, but at Go, it's the other way around. Another emerging player operating there is the UK-based Mash Gang, which had been importing highly acclaimed small-batch non-alcoholic beers to the U.S. and recently selected Pilot Project Brewing to facilitate their U.S. launch, which started this spring. There's a few layers to this story. Pilot Project Brewing was founded in Chicago in 2019 as a brewery incubator modeled after the music industry, where, much like new music artists could get help to grow their talents, Pilot helps smaller breweries get off the ground and in front of a larger audience more cost-effectively. Most of what they do is not in NA beer, but they currently act as the U.S. brewery for Mash Gang beers and more recently launched another NA label, Years, in collaboration with a talent manager from the music business. But back to Mash Gang for a minute. They are making some very high-quality, small-batch, non-alcoholic beer, and they're doing it with a brand attitude that you typically only see in the leaded brewery world. Their slogan is Liquid Rebellion for every unforgettable moment. There's a nod there to staying clear-minded, but it's not about health and wellness, which so many other NA breweries are doing. Their beer names include Journey Juice and Ritual, and the can art is phenomenal. For those of you who may be familiar with Asheville's Burial Beer, who we interviewed in episode 2, someone told us they think of Mash Gang as the burial of the NA world, and I wouldn't disagree. They're another one to watch for sure. All right, enough about all of that. On with the show. I'll give an introduction of Dave Zalatoris and his terrific craft beer podcast in a moment. But first I'll mention we wanted to have him on to set the stage ahead of our travels to Chicago next month. We think of NA beer as part of that larger scene, and while Dave covers Illinois beer and craft beer as a whole, he's a genuine fan of the NA category, and he really gets it. We talk about Chicago beer in general before going into his thoughts on the city's newer NA options, as well as his perspectives on NA beer overall. Unfortunately, we don't get into Mash Gang as he didn't get a chance to try it just yet. But we end with a talk of his pound-for-pound NA favorites and a little bit about hop waters that have popped up at many traditional breweries and what we hope is a precursor to brewing NA beer for at least some of them. He's a home brewer himself and has come up with a hop water recipe that he shares for anyone interested. Hope you enjoy the episode. All right. Dave Zalatoris is a lifelong Chicagoan. He's also the host of the Beer in Front podcast, where in over 200 episodes thus far, he has covered not only the Chicago beer scene, but craft beer in general, including some great episodes that have been focused on the NA space. Their slogan, which we're a big fan of, is sometimes the beer in front of you is the best one yet, which I think is a great way to think about enjoying a cold one. You can check out his show at beerinfront.com. Dave, welcome to the U.S. of NA.
John, thank you so much for having me.
So you've been doing the Beer in Front podcast since 2020. It sounds like it may have been a COVID project as a lot of new things came about during that time. We know you published your 200th episode a couple of months ago. And I know you don't just talk about Chicago beer, but what made you get started and what do you enjoy best about sharing your love of beer in Chicago with your listeners?
Well, it's pre-COVID. I beat COVID by about 2
Okay.
So when I started the show, I was anticipating going to breweries and doing all of this. And then, of course, the lockdown happened. So quickly had to pivot to do something else. But It's just a way to like use a different part of my brain. I'll be honest, and I mentioned it before, up until the time I started, I never listened to podcasts. Never. My wife would get on me all the time, oh, listen to this, listen to that. I'm like, no. So why I decided to do a podcast, I don't know, but I figure, all right, I'll do one. I love craft beer. I've been a huge craft beer fan since the first big wave in the mid-90s. And, I try to do a lot of like local area stuff because the Chicago area does have a vibrant beer scene. So I figured I'd always have material to talk about.
No, absolutely. And we know you have, speaking of Illinois, we know you have a project, the Drink Illinois Beer Project. So just curious to hear how that's going and what that's about.
It's going well. When I'm out in my travels, I try to pick up something different each time. Either talk about it on the podcast or do something on like a quick video, like a YouTube short. I'm rehabbing a back injury right now, so it's kind of difficult to sit for a long period of time. So right now I'm not able to like drive halfway across the state to go to a different brewery, but hopefully by the summertime that'll be healed and I'll be able to get out more and visit some places that, don't can or distribute. I'm also going to work with a couple other people like influencers and craft beer enthusiasts, and maybe they could do the review of the beer and I'll just have the Drink Illinois Beer tag on the bottom of the video.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds exciting. Before we go any further, I am drinking, since we're talking Chicago here, a Sunshine State Tropical IPA from Go Brewing. I feel a little bit bad. I believe I've been drinking this beer in another podcast episode, so I don't mean to have a repeat here, but it was the only Chicago beer, NA beer in my fridge, so I wanted to show some love there. What do you have on your end, Dave?
Well, when we were talking via email, you mentioned Pilot Project. So I went over there on Monday to pick something up, and they had a couple different ones. So the one I'm having, this is from Years Brewing in Chicago and Milwaukee. This is their Pilsner. You could tell it's just kind of a basic generic can. They're trying to go for that Montucky cold snack garage beer feel, I think, with just like this retro old school can. But I had this before and it's really good. The bartender there said this was his favorite, so always listen to a bartender.
They know what's best, don't they? So I know you didn't get to taste Mash Gang this trip, unfortunately, but what are your thoughts specifically on Go Brewing, as well as Pilot's New Year's Pilsner? I know you've sampled Go Brewing's beers many times, including at the brewery with founder Joe Chura, and just this past week you were able to try Years. I guess let's start there since I know you're drinking one right now. What do you think of that one so far?
I like it. Now this has... it doesn't list the ingredients here, but this gives you, if you consider like an old school macro beer that has like some corn to it, I get like a little corn taste to this. So it's really good, like a refreshing. This would be something like you'd have on a hot day or out in a barbecue where, you would drink something light and crushable like this, even though it's NA, but it has that same taste where I get a lot of the corn. I think this tastes good. Everything else from like the Chicago area has been good so far. I just wish there were more of them to talk about.
Well, hopefully very soon. So we were going to ask, are there any local breweries? I mean, certainly you're well connected there. Are you hearing anything about other breweries who are thinking about an NA or getting ready to release one soon?
Not that I've heard. I know a couple like of the bigger players here have come out with a hop water in the last year, and those seem to be doing well for them. So I don't know if NA beer would be a natural extension. I know Revolution has a hop water that does well. Noon Whistle, which is actually close to where you're going to be when you visit Joe over at Go Brewing, their hop water is one of the best I've had. So I haven't heard a lot about it, NA beer. I think breweries are getting into hop water just to attract more customers or attract customer that just doesn't drink for whatever.
Right. No, hop waters are a great entry point into the category for sure. And I know they're a lot easier to make for the breweries. So it's a good way. Many of them may offer sodas. Some might be locally made or kombuchas or other beverages that are NA. But to be able to have something with at least a little bit of a beer flavor that's at least made locally on site, I know is nice for many of them. So it's great to see that as an option. And certainly there's some good ones out there as well. So I'll come back to hop waters. We're gonna have a different conversation about that later. I know you've done some experimentation with that, so we'll come back to that. So you've talked to a number of non-alcoholic brewery owners in your podcast. I know we both have spoken with Lars over at Momentum. As somebody who's coming at this from the broader spectrum of all craft beer, what role do you see NA playing in the category? And do you envision a future where most of the breweries out there are going to have a non-alcoholic option for people to have?
I would hope so. I would hope that every brewery, and it's probably not going to be your small nano breweries that are just serving the neighborhood, but I would think more of your bigger players that do put beer in cans would come up with something, even if it's just for their tap room, if they don't want to distribute it, where you could have an NA version of their popular beer, whatever brewery, that is, where I think that would get more people to even try an NA beer, which they might not before. And I don't want to throw a name, but like we mentioned before, Sierra Nevada. So they have their NA. That would probably get somebody to pick up that can, knowing, oh, okay, I've heard good things about NA. Sierra's a good name. I'll try this. If your local or regional brewery has a great IPA and they put out an NA version of it, I think you're going to get people to try it, enjoy it, and then, hopefully the industry expands a little bit more.
For sure. No, I think you're right. And having NAs that are modeled after or styled after an existing beer that has its own following. I know both you and I are big fans of the Speedway Stout from AleSmith, and that's one that's modeled after an award-winning coffee stout. I think the original is at least 10% ABV, and so to make an NA version of that is interesting. I think you're right. That will pull people into the category and get people interested in the category, and hopefully make them think that, hey, there's some good non-alcoholic versions of drinks that I know very well or that I've tried before and that I know that are good.
Yeah, and somebody like me, I'm in my mid-50s. We've all put on a couple pounds that we shouldn't have. So you could have something, you're not getting those alcohol calories. Generally speaking, your NA beers are lower in calories, so even if you still enjoy a beer every now and then, like I do, you could have something good, refreshing. It'll give you that taste of a beer that you like. I just think it's beneficial for everyone.
So true. And I was going to ask you as well. We know Chicago, we mentioned Go and Mash Gang there. So two big NA brand names that are really just getting started from Chicago. But when you go out and about in Chicago, maybe not necessarily to breweries, but if you're out in restaurants or bars, and are you seeing many NA options? And if you are, what are the brands you're typically seeing there on the beer side?
Unfortunately, I wish I could see Go a little bit more. But I know like during dry January a few months ago, some breweries are putting options out there. But a lot of it was just like your athletics. I think I saw Partake at one. So I didn't see a lot. I didn't really see anything local. It was more of your national brand, which, I don't know what it's like for distribution. So maybe it was impossible for Go to be at your local bar. But yeah, I would like to see more local. But yeah, it was just the places that did it was the national brands that they had, or they were doing like mocktails instead of an NA beer to satisfy the NA crowd.
Right. No, that's very similar to what we've heard in talking to people across the country in different cities, even in other big cities like Chicago, where, and I think it's still an area dominated by the macro players as well. I know there's lots of restaurants. We've been to many places ourselves that are Heineken 0.0 is the option, or maybe Heineken 0.0 and Guinness 0 are the two options to have. Or if they have any craft beer option at all, it's athletic. And so it'll be interesting to see. As we know, people want choice, and craft beer drinkers in particular, I think, want choice. So hopefully there'll be some push to add some diversity to that menu and be able to have some different things and be able to try some more local things as more of those are able to get some wider distribution.
Yeah, Go isn't really a competitor of your big regional breweries here. So I think that would be a good fit where you might not have a Sierra Nevada, which would be a conflict, but something like Go, which isn't, I think that would be a good fit to promote like the region and the region's breweries.
For sure. So let's talk about some of your favorites now. I know you're drinking a year's you got over at Pilot, but what are some of the ones that you've really enjoyed as you've been out and about?
As I'm drinking this, I really like this one a lot. This is Years Brewing, Pilsner Years. This is excellent. So if you like that old school macro taste, I think you're going to enjoy this. The corn really comes through. We mentioned the Speedway Stout. I loved that. That was probably my favorite NA beer. Go puts out a sour. It's new school sour, and they rotate the flavors, and they've all been excellent. So that's something that's really good, which you might not expect from an NA, like a sour, but they did a really nice job with that. AleSmith, they also did an IPA that was good. And the ones I've had from Sierra, I really enjoyed. But probably I try to do more local stuff, so I think Go is pound for pound with the variety of styles that they have. All of them have been good. There's only been one that was but, that's just me. You're never going to like everything a brewery does. But no, everything that I've had from Go, I liked. One was just okay for me, but definitely nothing I would dump out.
That reminded me of a question I'd wanted to ask you on beer styles. So NA beer styles, in some cases, they could be very similar to what exists in the traditional beer, full alcohol world. And in other cases, it could be quite different. For me personally, I have always been a little bit mixed on sours. There's a few that I like, but for the most part, it's not a huge category for me personally. But I found some great NA sours that I really enjoy. And in fact, some of them are from Go that you were talking about there. Do you find, as a craft beer person overall, do you find that the NA beers that you like, are they of the same styles that you prefer in the traditional world, or are you finding things that you like a little bit better, or maybe not as well in the NA world that you do like in the traditional world?
Yeah, I'm an IPA person, so that would have been my first choice to grab something. But with like hazies in New England, you could hide a lot with hops. So something like a good Pilsner like this, it's very clean. You really can't hide any imperfections. So this is really good, and that's a style I would like to see more of.
So I'll give you an example. My wife is she's not an IPA person in the traditional beer world. She doesn't really like IPAs that are full alcohol, but she does like quite a few, including some from Go that are NAs. So I think there is opportunity to find or be a little bit open-minded to what your taste might be, and they might be different in the NA world than they are in the traditional world. And to your point as well, I think on the kind of classic Pilsners, there's been, I think, a little bit more. I know Partake Brewing just introduced a Pilsner. I know the new beer or one of the new beers that Athletic put out with Walker Hayes, the Fancy Like. That's kind of a classic American pale. It's not a Pilsner, it's a pale ale, but kind of that similar, just it's a regular beer. It's got some good flavors to it. Nothing, not trying to be fancy like, I guess. So hopefully we'll see some more of that. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to hop waters. I know that when we were talking before, that's something that you've dabbled into. And again, I think it's an important piece of the category just because it does allow, I think, a wider swath of breweries to maybe participate in the non-alcoholic category and to have something that they crafted to be able to sell in their tap rooms. And it's great to see that. And there's some bigger national brands obviously out there they're also very successfully making some really good hop water. So what's your experience been with those? And I know you have maybe a recipe that you could possibly share with us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I started getting into hop waters. I think the first one I had was Lagunitas, their hoppy refresher, when it first came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And that one I really, really liked. Then around here, you didn't see it as much. And then last year, it just seemed like they were everywhere. Like you had the hop water brand, you have like some hop flavored teas. There were just a ton of brands that were out there. But for me, and I don't know, it just seemed like ridiculous to spend practically the same price that you would for a 6-pack of beer for hop water. I'm like, well, there's no malt in this. So it was kind of hard to justify spending, $10 on a 6-pack of something. And most of the commercial hop waters that were out there were flavored anyway. I'm like, well, if I'm going to have a berry hop water, I'll just buy a berry LaCroix.
Right.
So I started tinkering a little bit. I bought a hop extract from one of the hop manufacturers, and it wasn't well. Let me tell you, it was a crime scene in here. The first ones I did, I just poured a little of the extract in my glass. So, I'm tinkering. I'm like, well, what if I steep hops in water and then, put that in the soda stream. It was an explosion. It was hop water everywhere. I'm glad my wife was like taking a nap and didn't see this, but it was like, if you ever watch like YouTube videos of somebody putting a Mentos in a 2-liter bottle of like Coca-Cola, that's what this was. And I'm like, it was on the ceiling. It was everywhere. So I'm like, all right, well, this isn't going to work. So, but I come up with a way that it does work. And I have a mini-keg that takes those little CO2 cartridges. I make the hop water and then I carbonate it. And that's been fantastic. I read one thing on the American Homebrewers Association website where they said, to use a little yeast and a little citric acid. And that really helps a lot because some of the hop waters that I've tried, I get that raw hop taste to it where it just doesn't taste the same. And it doesn't bother me as much being a home brewer, but it's just, I don't know, hops react differently with malt and with yeast. And it kind of softens them a little bit. It's not as like harsh as this raw hop taste. So that I added that to the recipe. I used a little bit of brewer's yeast, like a half a teaspoon. I didn't use a lot. And also citric acid. And that really like softened the hop flavors, really brought out more. It gave it that little citric taste to it. So that was really good.
Sounds like there's a little bit of trial and error there that had to happen first, just like any new process or new brewing process. But it sounds like you've figured it out.
Yeah, but don't use the soda stream. But no, it's really easy. If anybody wants to try it, what I did is I took a half a gallon of filtered water, so roughly, a growler. I took a half an ounce of hops and pellet hops, whatever kind of hops you like. Some people are big into like Citra hops or Cascade. I tried a hop called Lemon Drop. That was excellent. That would be like my go-to choice. Just let it steep overnight. They add a little citric acid, a little brewer's yeast, and the next day, just, carbonate it in the fridge and you're like your little mini keg or whatever you have. And it's delicious. And it's a lot cheaper than spending $10 on a 6-pack of something.
Well, we will share that recipe in our show notes for anybody who's interested in trying to replicate it and hopefully learn from some of the early trials there and don't get any liquid on the ceiling. We don't want any of that. That sounds delicious. Perhaps the best hop water will be the hop water in front of us if we could master it. So we appreciate you sharing that recipe with us, Dave. And we also appreciate you sharing your knowledge of not just the Chicago beer scene, but the NA beer scene. It's one of our favorite cities. I may live in Georgia now, but I'm originally from Cleveland. So I'm a upper Midwesterner at heart.
Okay.
And I'm excited to see what's happening there and the overall craft beer scene, as well as obviously the NA scene as well. So appreciate you joining us and hope to talk to you again in the future and hope to be able to see you when we're up there in June. Hopefully we can make that work out. Well, I want to again thank Dave for coming on the show. It's always really interesting to us to get a perspective on non-alcoholic beer from someone who is part of the craft beer community overall. And this was a great conversation to have ahead of our short road trip coming up. As mentioned, we'll be sticking with the Midwest for the next couple of episodes. We're going to be at Go Brewing, Pilot Project Brewing, as well as Generation NA in the early part of June. Those are some huge players in the NA beer movement the past couple of years. We've talked about Go at length already in this episode and in the past, but in case you're not familiar with Generation NA, I think we've given them some shout-outs as well. They're an alcohol-free bottle shop in Lafayette, Indiana, about 125 miles south of Chicago. They've become a fixture in the category and have been influencers in creating local NA through some collaborations. Hoping to check out some of those as well while we're there. They're also in the middle of a college town. Purdue University is there. Go Boilers. So while it's a small town, it's also full of Gen Zers that are exactly who the media and statistics are telling us isn't drinking much anymore. So we'll get into all of that. And until then, cheers.